She shuffled through the corridors of Naval Air Station Coronado like any other cafeteria worker, finishing her evening shift. Her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished linoleum floors. Sarah Mitchell had perfected the art of invisibility. Over 3 decades, moving through one of America's most secure naval installations as unremarkably as furniture. Officers in crisp white uniforms passed her without a glance, their conversations about flight schedules and mission briefings flowing around her as if she were made of air. Just another aging woman in a food service smock, counting down the years until retirement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Until Admiral Robert Hayes caught sight of her wrist as she reached to clear a forgotten coffee cup from the officer's lounge. The Hamilton watch with its distinctive maritime chronometer face and weathered leather strap stopped him cold. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers, ceramic exploding against the deck in a shower of navy blue fragments. Because that watch, that specific timepiece with its faded serial number DF447, belonged to someone who had been declared lost at sea 38 years ago. Someone whose name was etched in black granite on the wall of the lost at the Naval Heritage Center. Someone who should have been nothing more than a memory and a flag-draped coffin that had never held a body. But there she stood, alive and breathing, wearing the proof of an impossible truth on her wrist. Admiral Hayes felt the blood drain from his face as decades of carefully buried secrets came rushing back like a tsunami of classified nightmares. The Silent Service Protocol, Operation Deep Current, the USS Seahawk incident that had never made the official reports, and the 7 naval intelligence operatives who had vanished into the dark waters of the North Pacific, taking their secrets with them to what everyone assumed was a watery grave. Sarah Mitchell clocked out of her shift at the Anchor's Rest dining facility with the same methodical precision she had maintained for the past 12 years. The institutional kitchen hummed with the familiar sounds of industrial dishwashers and steam tables cooling down for the night, a symphony of mundane routine that had become the soundtrack to her carefully constructed ordinary life. At 62, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing the same burgundy uniform polo that identified her as part of Compass Point Catering Services, she had achieved something that most people never realized there. Witnessing perfect camouflage in plain sight. The night supervisor, Maria Gonzalez, barely looked up from her clipboard as Sarah hung up her apron and gathered her small purse. "Same time tomorrow, Sarah," Maria called out with the casual indifference of someone who had worked alongside the same person for over a decade without truly seeing them. "We've got that big brass dinner on Thursday, so we'll need extra hands in the prep kitchen." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement, the gesture so automatic it barely registered as communication. In 12 years of working at NAS Coronado, she had perfected the delicate balance of being competent enough to keep her job, but unremarkable enough to remain invisible. She arrived precisely on time, performed her duties without complaint, and left without fanfare. Her co-workers knew she lived alone in a modest apartment in Imperial Beach, that she had never married, and that she seemed to have no family or close friends. Beyond these surface details, Sarah Mitchell remained as mysterious as fog rolling in from the Pacific, and just as easily overlooked. The evening air carried the salt tang of San Diego Bay as Sarah made her way across the sprawling base toward the bus stop that would take her home to her small apartment. Naval Air Station Coronado after dark took on a different character than during the bustling daylight hours. The sounds of jet engines and helicopter rotors had given way to the distant hum of generators and the occasional footsteps of security. Patrols making their rounds. Floodlights cast long shadows between the hangars and administrative buildings, creating a landscape of light and darkness that Sarah navigated with the unconscious ease of someone who had walked these paths thousands of times. She paused at the commissary to pick up a few groceries, moving through the aisles with the efficient purposefulness of someone who had long ago reduced shopping to a purely functional exercise. Frozen dinners, instant coffee, basic toiletries, the purchasing habits of a person who viewed food as fuel and comfort as an unnecessary luxury. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The young sailor working the checkout counter, someone named Rodriguez according to his name tape, gave her the same polite but distant smile he offered every customer. In 12 years of shopping at this commissary, Sarah doubted anyone who worked there could have picked her out of a lineup. As she waited for the base shuttle that would take her to the main gate, Sarah found herself standing near a group of junior officers who were engaged in animated discussion about their upcoming deployment. Lieutenant Jake Thompson, a pilot whose swagger was as pronounced as his perfectly pressed flight suit, was holding court with his typical combination of technical knowledge and cocky bravado. The new sonar mapping system they're installing on the carriers is supposed to be revolutionary, Thompson was saying to his audience of equally young aviators. They claim it can track submarine signatures at ranges that were impossible just 5 years ago. Something about quantum acoustic processing that I honestly don't pretend to understand. His companion, Lieutenant Commander Ashley Brooks, nodded with the serious expression of someone trying to appear more knowledgeable than she actually was. The briefing materials mentioned it's designed to counter some new stealth submarine technology that certain hostile nations have been developing. Apparently, the old detection methods are becoming obsolete. Sarah continued waiting for her shuttle, her expression as neutral as always, but something in her posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders had straightened slightly, and her eyes, which typically held the mild, unfocused gaze of someone lost in routine thoughts, had sharpened with an alertness that would have been noticeable to anyone who knew what to look for. But Lieutenant Thompson and his colleagues saw only what they expected to see: a middle-aged cafeteria worker waiting for transportation home after another unremarkable day of serving their meals. Thompson laughed with the casual arrogance of youth. Honestly, I don't know why they don't just ask some of the old-timers from the submarine service. I bet half the guys sitting in VFW halls around San Diego have forgotten more about underwater warfare than these computer programmers will ever know. The shuttle arrived with a hydraulic hiss, and Sarah climbed aboard, along with a handful of other civilian contractors and off-duty personnel. She took a seat near the back, as was her habit, and watched the lights of the naval station slide past the windows as they made their way toward the main gate. The conversation about submarine detection technology continued around her, but she appeared to pay it no more attention than she would to a discussion of baseball scores or weekend plans. However, as the shuttle approached the security checkpoint, Sarah's hand moved almost unconsciously to her left wrist, where beneath the sleeve of her uniform polo, a worn leather watch strap held a timepiece that had been keeping perfect time for nearly 4 decades. The Hamilton watch had been a gift from the U.S. Navy in 1985, issued to a select group of intelligence specialists whose missions were so classified that their very existence was denied by official records. The watch's face bore the distinctive maritime chronometer design that had been standard issue for naval reconnaissance personnel, and its serial number, DF447, corresponded to a unit designation that appeared in no database accessible to conventional military investigators. Sarah had worn that watch through missions that had taken her into the deepest, most dangerous waters of the Cold War. She had worn it during briefings in windowless rooms where admirals spoke in whispers about threats that could never be acknowledged publicly. She had worn it while descending in submersibles to depths where sunlight had never penetrated, gathering intelligence that had helped prevent conflicts the American public would never know had been brewing beneath the surface of international diplomacy. and she had been wearing it on the morning of March 15, 1985, when the USS Seahawk had disappeared from all official records, taking with it 7 of the Navy's most highly trained underwater reconnaissance specialists. The world had been told that the submarine had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure during routine training exercises, that all hands had been lost, and that the wreckage had sunk in waters too deep for recovery. Memorial services had been held, families had been notified, and names had been engraved on monuments to the fallen. But Sarah Mitchell knew the truth that lay beneath those official lies, because she had been there when the Seahawk had surfaced in waters that didn't appear on any civilian maps. When her team had been transferred to a vessel that bore no identifying markings, and when they had been given new identities and orders that would keep them operating in the shadows for decades to come, the submarine hadn't been destroyed. The crew hadn't died. They had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity, becoming ghosts in the machine of American naval intelligence. For 38 years, Sarah had maintained the cover identity that had been created for her in the aftermath of the Seahawk incident. She had lived quietly, worked ordinary jobs, and waited for orders that she had begun to believe would never come. The other members of her team had been scattered to the winds, each given their own cover stories and assigned to different regions of the country. Contact between them had been forbidden except in the most extreme circumstances, and those circumstances had been defined in terms so catastrophic that Sarah had never expected to see them fulfilled. The shuttle reached the main gate, and Sarah disembarked along with the other passengers. She showed her ID to the security guard, received the same polite nod she had been getting for 12 years, and walked the 6 blocks to her apartment building. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with most residents settled in for the evening. Streetlights cast pools of orange illumination along the sidewalks, and the distant sound of waves breaking against the Imperial Beach shoreline provided a constant, soothing background rhythm. Sarah's apartment was a study in deliberate mediocrity. The furniture was functional, but not distinctive. The decorations were generic prints that could have been found in any discount store, and the overall atmosphere was that of a temporary space occupied by someone who had never quite settled in permanently. The only items that suggested any personality or history were a small collection of books about maritime history and a single framed photograph of a group of young naval officers standing on the deck of a submarine. The faces in the photograph were barely visible due to the fading of the colors over time, and anyone examining it would have assumed it was a memento from Sarah's long-ago youth, perhaps a brother or boyfriend who had served in the Navy. In reality, the photograph showed Sarah herself at age 24, along with the 6 other members of the Deep Current team, taken just days before their official deaths and unofficial rebirth as the most highly classified intelligence operatives in the history of the U.S. Navy. She kept the photograph, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of who she had been and who she might need to become again if the circumstances ever demanded it. That evening, as Sarah prepared a simple dinner and settled in to watch the local news, she had no idea that those circumstances were already beginning to align. Halfway around the world, in the depths of the North Pacific, a new class of submarine was conducting tests that would soon trigger protocols that had been dormant for nearly 4 decades. Intelligence agencies were beginning to detect signatures that matched patterns from classified files that most analysts didn't even know existed. And in the highest levels of naval command, admirals were starting to ask questions about threats that bore disturbing similarities to scenarios that had been gamed out in the 1980s by a team of specialists who were officially listed as casualties of a training accident. Sarah finished her dinner, washed her single plate and fork, and prepared for bed with the same methodical routine she had followed for 12 years. She set her alarm for 5:30 a.m., laid out her uniform for the next day, and checked the locks on her front door. As she had every night for 38 years, she wound her Hamilton watch and placed it on the nightstand beside her bed, where its steady ticking would mark the passage of another night in her carefully constructed ordinary life. She could not have known that in less than 24 hours, that life would be shattered by a chance encounter with someone who possessed the knowledge to recognize what her watch truly represented. She could not have known that Admiral Robert Hayes had been a junior intelligence officer in 1985, one of the few people outside the Deep Current team itself who had been briefed on the true nature of the Seahawk incident. And she could not have known that recent intelligence reports crossing his desk had been triggering memories of briefings from decades past, causing him to wonder if the specialists who had been presumed lost might still be out there, waiting for a signal that it was time to emerge from the shadows. As Sarah drifted off to sleep in her modest apartment, the watch on her nightstand continued its faithful timekeeping, just as it had for 38 years of patient waiting. Tomorrow would bring another shift at the Anchor's Rest dining facility. Another day of serving meals to naval officers who saw her as nothing more than part of the institutional furniture. But tomorrow would also bring the moment when past and present would collide with the force of a depth charge detonating in still waters, and Sarah Mitchell would discover that some secrets are too important to stay buried forever. The Hamilton watch ticked steadily through the night, marking time toward a reckoning that was already in motion, carried forward by currents as deep and inexorable as those that flow through the darkest trenches of the world's oceans. In 12 hours, the woman the world knew as Sarah Mitchell would take the first steps toward reclaiming an identity that had been submerged for nearly 4 decades, and the United States Navy would be forced to confront the consequences of decisions made when the Cold War still cast its shadow across every aspect of American foreign policy. But for now, there was only the quiet apartment, the sleeping woman, and the watch that had never stopped keeping time for a mission that had never truly ended. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Abraham Washington. As Sarah Mitchell made her way through the security checkpoint at Naval Air Station Coronado, her ID badge, bearing the Compass Point Catering Services logo, received the same cursory glance it had earned every workday for the past 12 years. The security officer, Petty Officer Martinez, nodded with the mechanical courtesy of someone who had processed thousands of contractor badges without ever truly seeing the faces behind them. "Morning, ma'am," Martinez said, his attention already shifting to the next person in line before Sarah had even clipped her temporary access badge to her uniform polo. The badge itself was a study in institutional dismissal, printed on cheap cardstock with contractor escort required, stamped in red letters that seemed designed to emphasize the holder's temporary and subordinate status within the naval hierarchy. Sarah moved through the maze of security barriers with practiced efficiency, her worn canvas bag containing nothing more threatening than a thermos of coffee, a paperback romance novel, and the kind of generic brown bag lunch that spoke of a life lived on the margins of other people's important work. To anyone observing her progress through the checkpoint, she appeared to be exactly what her paperwork claimed, a food service worker, arriving for another day of preparing meals for people whose lives and missions were infinitely more significant than her own. The base was already bustling with the controlled chaos of a major naval installation coming to life. F-18 Super Hornets screamed overhead as they conducted morning training flights, their afterburners painting streaks of flame against the pale California sky. Ground crews moved with purposeful urgency around aircraft that cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, their technical expertise evident in every precise movement as they prepared multi-million-dollar machines for operations that could determine the fate of nations. Sarah walked past these displays of military might with the same expression of mild disinterest that she might have shown toward rush-hour traffic or a crowded shopping mall. Her route to the Anchor's Rest dining facility took her through the heart of the base's operational area, past hangars filled with sophisticated aircraft and administrative buildings where admirals and generals made decisions that rippled across the globe. She moved through this landscape of power and technology like a ghost, present but unnoticed, part of the infrastructure that kept the machinery of defense functioning, but never acknowledged as essential to its operation. The dining facility itself occupied a sprawling single-story building that had been designed with functionality rather than aesthetics in mind. Industrial kitchen equipment hummed behind serving counters that stretched the length of the main dining room, and the air carried the institutional aromas of mass-produced food that would fuel the thousands of personnel who depended on the facility for their daily sustenance. Sarah entered through the employee entrance, exchanging brief nods with coworkers who knew her name but little else about her life beyond these walls. Maria Gonzalez, the day shift supervisor, was already reviewing the morning prep schedule when Sarah arrived at the time clock. A woman in her mid-40s who had worked her way up from dishwasher to management over the course of 2 decades, Maria possessed the kind of practical competence that kept large institutions functioning smoothly. She glanced up from her clipboard as Sarah punched in, offering the kind of superficial pleasantness that characterized most workplace interactions. "We've got a special breakfast set up in Conference Room Alpha this morning," Maria explained, her tone carrying the slight stress that always accompanied requests from high-ranking officers. "Some kind of briefing for the Carrier Strike Group commanders. They want the full service treatment, which means real china instead of the usual cafeteria trays." Sarah nodded her understanding, accepting the assignment with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her approach to every task over the past 12 years. Special events like this were routine occurrences at a facility that served one of the Navy's most important installations, and she had long ago perfected the art of providing impeccable service while remaining essentially invisible to the officers being served. Conference Room Alpha was located in the base's primary administrative building, an imposing structure that housed the offices of senior commanders and served as the nerve center for operations affecting the entire Pacific Fleet. The room itself had been designed to accommodate high-level briefings, with sophisticated audiovisual equipment, secure communication systems, and seating for several dozen senior officers. When Sarah arrived with the catering cart, the space was already being prepared by base personnel, who moved with the focused intensity that always preceded important briefings. Commander Lisa Rodriguez was supervising the room preparation with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had earned her a reputation as one of the most competent staff officers in the Pacific Fleet. A graduate of the Naval Academy with advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies, Rodriguez had spent her career navigating the complex world of naval intelligence and operations planning. She glanced up from her tablet as Sarah began setting up the breakfast service, her expression carrying the polite but distant acknowledgement that senior officers typically showed toward support personnel. "Just set everything up along the back wall," Rodriguez instructed, her tone professional but lacking any real warmth or interest. "The briefing starts at 0800, so we'll need everything ready by 0745. These officers will be discussing classified materials, so you'll need to finish your setup and leave before the session begins." Sarah acknowledged the instructions with a simple nod, beginning the methodical process of arranging coffee urns, pastry platters, and the formal place settings that had been requested for the occasion. Her movements were economical and precise, the result of years of experience in similar situations where efficiency and invisibility were equally important. As she worked, other personnel continued their preparations around her, adjusting lighting, testing audio equipment, and reviewing security protocols. Lieutenant Jake Thompson arrived early, as was his habit for important briefings, his flight suit perfectly pressed and his pilot's wings gleaming against the dark blue fabric. At 28, Thompson embodied the confidence and swagger that characterized the Navy's elite aviators, men and women who had been selected and trained to operate some of the most sophisticated aircraft ever built. He poured himself coffee from the urn Sarah had just finished setting up, barely acknowledging her presence as he engaged in conversation with Commander Rodriguez about the morning's agenda. "I hear we're finally getting some real intelligence about those new submarine signatures that have been showing up in the North Pacific," Thompson said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone eager to engage with genuine operational challenges, rather than routine training exercises. "About time we got some clarity on what we're dealing with out there." Rodriguez's expression became more guarded, a reminder that even among cleared personnel, certain information required careful handling. "The briefing will cover recent developments in undersea warfare capabilities," she replied diplomatically. "Admiral Hayes will be providing context based on historical precedents and current intelligence assessments." As more officers arrived for the briefing, Sarah continued her work with practiced invisibility, refilling coffee urns and ensuring that the breakfast service met the exacting standards expected for senior officer gatherings. Captain Mark Sullivan, the executive officer of the USS Abraham Washington, nodded politely in her direction as he helped himself to coffee, but his attention was clearly focused on the classified folders that other officers were beginning to review. The conversation around the breakfast table gradually shifted toward technical discussions of sonar capabilities, submarine detection protocols, and the evolving challenges of underwater warfare in an era of rapidly advancing technology. Sarah moved among the officers like a piece of well-maintained equipment, present when needed, but otherwise unnoticed as they discussed matters of national security with the casual familiarity of professionals who dealt with such issues on a daily basis. "The problem with these new stealth technologies," Captain Sullivan was explaining to a group of younger officers, "is that they're making our traditional detection methods obsolete faster than we can develop countermeasures. We're essentially fighting the last war while our potential adversaries are already preparing for the next one." Lieutenant Commander Ashley Brooks, a naval intelligence specialist who had recently transferred to the Pacific Fleet from Pentagon duty, nodded thoughtfully as she reviewed a classified briefing document. "The patterns we're seeing suggest a level of sophistication that goes beyond simple technological advancement," she observed. "Someone has clearly studied our capabilities in great detail and developed specific countermeasures designed to exploit our weaknesses." Sarah finished arranging the last of the pastries and began gathering her serving equipment, preparing to leave before the classified briefing officially began. As she worked, her movements took her close enough to the officers' conversation to overhear technical details that would have been meaningless to most civilian contractors, but carried profound significance for someone with her background and training. The discussion had turned to specific acoustic signatures and sonar interpretation techniques, subjects that had been central to Sarah's original training 3 decades earlier. She recognized terminology and concepts that had been classified at the highest levels during her active service, information that should have been accessible only to personnel with specialized clearances and need-to-know authorization. The casual way these officers discussed such sensitive, technical details suggested that the classification levels of certain information had been reduced over time, or that the current threat situation had necessitated broader distribution of previously restricted intelligence. As Sarah loaded her cart and prepared to leave Conference Room Alpha, she caught fragments of conversation that caused her to pause almost imperceptibly in her work. Lieutenant Thompson was describing sonar contacts that matched patterns from intelligence files that most of the officers present had never seen. Files that contained analysis of submarine capabilities from the 1980s when the Cold War had driven both superpowers to invest heavily in underwater warfare technologies. The acoustic signature analysis suggests we're dealing with hull designs that incorporate stealth technologies first developed in the mid-1980s, Thompson was saying, reading from a classified assessment. But the implementation is far more advanced than anything we documented from that period. It's as if someone took 30-year-old research and had decades to perfect it. Commander Rodriguez leaned forward with increased interest, her expression reflecting the kind of professional concern that senior intelligence officers developed when confronting unfamiliar threats. Are we talking about technology that was stolen from American research programs, or something that was developed independently by hostile nations? The question hung in the air as Sarah quietly wheeled her cart toward the exit, her departure timed to avoid drawing attention from officers who were becoming increasingly absorbed in their classified discussions. But as she reached the door, Lieutenant Thompson made a comment that caused her to freeze for just a moment, her hand resting on the door handle as she absorbed the implications of what she had just heard. According to the historical files, we had our own research programs in underwater stealth technology back in the 1980s, Thompson continued. But most of that work was classified at levels that make it inaccessible even now. There are references to something called Operation Deep Current, but the actual details are still buried in compartmented files that require special authorization to access. Sarah's grip tightened on the door handle, her knuckles whitening as she fought to maintain her composure. Operation Deep Current had been the umbrella designation for the research and operational programs that had led to her team's deployment. Aboard the USS Seahawk, the fact that the name was appearing in current intelligence assessments meant that someone in the naval hierarchy had begun connecting patterns that should have remained buried in the deepest classified archives. She forced herself to complete her exit from the conference room, moving with the same unhurried pace that had characterized her arrival. But as she walked through the corridors of the administrative building, pushing her cart back toward the dining facility, Sarah's mind was racing through implications and possibilities that she had not considered for decades. The casual mention of Operation Deep Current in a routine intelligence briefing suggested that the current submarine threat was serious enough to warrant digging into historical files that contained information about her former unit. The rest of Sarah's morning passed in a blur of routine kitchen duties that she performed with automatic efficiency, while her thoughts remained focused on the conversation she had overheard. She prepared lunch service for the base's enlisted personnel, cleaned equipment that had been used for the officers' breakfast, and completed inventory tasks that were part of her regular responsibilities. To her co-workers, she appeared no different than she had on any other day, performing her duties with the same quiet competence that had characterized her work for 12 years. But beneath the surface of her carefully maintained routine, Sarah was conducting a mental review of protocols and procedures that she had not needed to consider since her original training. The mention of Operation Deep Current in current intelligence briefings meant that her dormant mission status might be approaching activation, and she found herself automatically checking escape routes, assessing potential surveillance, and reviewing communication procedures that had been drilled into her memory decades earlier. Part 3. The condescending escort. The afternoon brought an unexpected disruption to Sarah's carefully ordered routine when Maria Gonzalez approached her workstation with an expression that suggested administrative complications. In her hand was a work order bearing official Navy letterhead, the kind of document that typically meant additional duties beyond the normal scope of food service operations. "Sarah, I need you to handle a special catering request," Maria explained, her tone carrying the slight exasperation that always accompanied last-minute changes to established schedules. "Admiral Hayes is hosting a working dinner tonight in his private dining room, and they've specifically requested our most experienced server. You've got the best track record with VIP events, so you're elected." Sarah accepted the assignment with her characteristic quiet nod, but internally, she felt a slight tension that had nothing to do with the additional workload. Admiral Robert Hayes commanded the Pacific Fleet's submarine operations, a position that would have given him access to historical files and intelligence assessments related to underwater warfare programs. The coincidence of being assigned to serve at his private dinner on the same day she had overheard discussions of Operation Deep Current struck her as potentially significant. though she forced herself to maintain the assumption that it was merely an accident of scheduling. The assignment required her to remain on base past her normal shift, which meant calling the supervisor at her apartment building to explain that she would be returning later than usual. Such deviations from routine had become rare in Sarah's carefully structured life, and she found herself paying closer attention to details that might indicate whether her presence at the Admiral's dinner was truly coincidental or the result of some deeper institutional awareness of her background. Petty Officer First Class Jennifer Park arrived at the dining facility at 1600 hours to escort Sarah to the Admiral's quarters, her demeanor reflecting the kind of professional courtesy that junior personnel typically showed toward civilian contractors. Park was a communications specialist whose normal duties involved classified message handling and secure communications protocols, assignments that suggested she possessed security clearances well above those typically required for escorting food service personnel. "Ms. Mitchell, I'll be your escort for this evening's event," Park explained as Sarah gathered the specialized serving equipment required for formal dinner service. "Admiral Hayes is hosting several senior officers from the submarine community, so we'll need to follow enhanced security protocols throughout the evening." The walk to the Admiral's quarters took them through sections of the base that Sarah had never visited during her 12 years of employment, areas that required higher security clearances and served functions more sensitive than the routine operations she had become accustomed to observing. Park maintained a steady stream of commentary about base procedures and security requirements, her tone carrying the kind of patient condescension that suggested she viewed Sarah as someone who required detailed explanations of obvious protocols. "The Admiral's quarters are located in the restricted access zone," Park continued as they passed through additional security checkpoints, each staffed by armed guards who scrutinized their credentials with professional thoroughness. "Civilian contractors are normally prohibited from this area, but special exceptions can be made for essential personnel with appropriate escorts and security reviews." Sarah nodded politely at the explanations, maintaining the facade of someone who was impressed by glimpses into the Navy's operational security measures. But her trained eye was automatically cataloging details that would have been invisible to a genuine civilian contractor: the placement of security cameras, the rotation schedules of guard posts, the types of communications equipment visible in various administrative offices, and the general layout of facilities that were clearly designed to house sensitive operations. The Admiral's quarters occupied a spacious suite within a building that had been constructed during the height of the Cold War, when senior naval officers had required facilities that could serve both residential and operational functions during extended periods of heightened alert status. The architecture reflected the era's emphasis on functionality over aesthetics, with thick walls that could accommodate secure communications equipment and meeting spaces that could be quickly converted for crisis management operations. Park's commentary continued as they approached the building, her explanations becoming increasingly detailed as she warmed to her role as guide and instructor. "Admiral Hayes uses these facilities for hosting visiting dignitaries and conducting informal briefings with senior staff," she explained. "Tonight's dinner includes several submarine commanders who are being briefed on new operational requirements, so the conversation will likely focus on technical matters that might seem boring to civilian personnel." The subtle dismissal in Park's comment was typical of the attitude that Sarah had encountered throughout her years of service and support roles, a casual assumption that civilian contractors lacked the education or experience to find military operations genuinely interesting. Such attitudes had become useful tools in maintaining her cover identity, allowing her to observe and listen without generating curiosity about her level of understanding or engagement with technical discussions. Inside the Admiral's quarters, Sarah began the methodical process of preparing for formal dinner service, while Park provided running commentary about proper protocols for serving senior officers. The dining room itself was elegantly appointed. but not ostentatious, with nautical artwork and ship models that reflected the Admiral's career and professional interests. A large oil painting depicted the USS Nautilus, the Navy's first nuclear submarine, while glass cases displayed artifacts from various submarine operations spanning several decades of service. When serving Admiral Hayes and his guests, you'll need to be especially careful about maintaining appropriate distance and avoiding any interruption of their conversations, Park instructed, her tone suggesting that she was dealing with someone who had never served high-ranking officials before. These officers will be discussing classified operational matters, so you'll need to focus entirely on your service duties and avoid any appearance of listening to their discussions. Sarah acknowledged the instructions with appropriate deference, while privately noting the irony of being warned away from conversations that might well concern operations and intelligence programs in which she had played a central role decades earlier. She began arranging the formal place settings that had been requested for the evening, using china and silverware that bore the official seal of the Pacific Fleet and reflected the importance of the officers who would be dining at the Admiral's table. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Sarah completed her preparations with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her performance in countless similar situations over the years. Every aspect of the dinner service had been planned and rehearsed to ensure that the Admiral and his guests would be able to focus entirely on their discussions without distraction from logistical concerns or service problems. Park's oversight of these preparations gradually became less intensive as she gained confidence in Sarah's competence and professionalism. "You clearly have experience with VIP events," Park observed, her initial condescension giving way to grudging professional respect. "The Admiral is very particular about service standards, but you seem to understand what's required." The first guests began arriving at 1900 hours. A collection of senior submarine officers whose ribbons and insignia indicated extensive operational experience and high-level security clearances. Sarah recognized several names from the evening's guest list as commanders of some of the Navy's most advanced submarines, men and women whose vessels represented the cutting edge of underwater warfare technology and whose missions took them into some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Captain James Morrison, commanding officer of the USS Virginia, arrived first. His reputation as one of the Navy's most innovative submarine commanders preceding him into the Admiral's dining room. Commander Patricia Chun, recently promoted to executive officer of the USS Seawolf, followed shortly afterward, her presence indicating that the evening's discussions would likely involve the Navy's most advanced and classified submarine programs. As the officers gathered for cocktails before dinner, their conversation naturally gravitated toward technical subjects and operational challenges that reflected their shared professional background. Sarah moved among them with practiced invisibility, serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres while they discussed matters ranging from new sonar technologies to crew training protocols for extended deployments. The latest intelligence assessments suggest we're facing submarine capabilities that exceed our current detection parameters, Captain Morrison was explaining to Commander Chun as Sarah refreshed their drinks. "We're going to need to fundamentally rethink our approach to underwater surveillance and response protocols." Commander Chun nodded thoughtfully, her expression reflecting the kind of professional concern that senior officers developed when confronting operational challenges that exceeded established doctrines. "The historical precedents aren't encouraging," she replied. "Every time we've faced a significant technological surprise in submarine warfare, it's taken years to develop effective countermeasures." The conversation continued as additional guests arrived, each bringing their own perspectives on the challenges facing the submarine community in an era of rapidly evolving threats and technological capabilities. Sarah observed these discussions with the same expression of polite disinterest that she had maintained throughout 12 years of serving naval officers, but her trained mind was automatically processing information and identifying patterns. That would have been invisible to a genuine civilian contractor. Admiral Hayes himself appeared shortly before dinner service was scheduled to begin, his presence immediately commanding the attention and respect of his assembled guests. At 55, Hayes possessed the kind of quiet authority that characterized the Navy's most effective senior commanders, men and women whose careers had been built on technical competence, operational experience, and the ability to make critical decisions under pressure. "Gentlemen, ladies," Admiral Hayes addressed his guests as Sarah completed the final preparations for dinner service. "Tonight's discussion will focus on historical precedents for current challenges we're facing in submarine operations. Some of the information we'll be reviewing has been declassified specifically for this briefing, and I believe you'll find the historical context illuminating." Sarah began serving the first course as the officers took their seats, her movements economical and unobtrusive as the conversation shifted toward more specific technical details. The discussion that followed would prove to be unlike any she had overheard during her years of service at Naval Air Station Coronado, touching on subjects and programs that she had not heard mentioned since her original briefings 3 decades earlier. Part 4. Peak Dismissal and Behavioral Hints. The dinner conversation that unfolded around Admiral Hayes' table represented the kind of high-level, technical discussion that Sarah had not encountered since her active duty days. A detailed examination of submarine warfare capabilities that drew on classified intelligence and operational experience spanning several decades. As she served successive courses with practiced efficiency, the officers' discussion revealed layers of complexity in current underwater threats that clearly had senior naval leadership deeply concerned about the adequacy of existing countermeasures. Captain Morrison had brought with him a briefcase containing classified analysis documents that he began referencing as the conversation progressed beyond general observations toward specific operational concerns. "The acoustic signatures we've been tracking in the North Pacific represent a fundamental departure from known submarine design principles," he explained, spreading detailed sonar analysis charts across the table between courses. "These contacts are exhibiting stealth characteristics that shouldn't be possible with any technology we've documented from hostile nations." Commander Chun leaned forward to examine the technical data, her expression reflecting the kind of professional alarm that experienced submarine officers developed when confronting unfamiliar threats. "The propulsion signatures suggest nuclear power plants, but the acoustic dampening is unlike anything in our databases," she observed. "It's as if someone has been developing advanced submarine technology in complete isolation from our intelligence collection efforts." Sarah moved around the table refilling water glasses and clearing plates, her presence so thoroughly accepted as part of the background that the officers continued their classified discussions without any apparent concern about operational security. This level of casual disregard for her potential ability to understand or remember their conversations represented a form of institutional blindness that she had encountered throughout her cover career, an assumption that civilian contractors lacked the education or background to comprehend military technical discussions. Admiral Hayes had been listening to his subordinates' analysis with the kind of focused attention that suggested he possessed information that would provide additional context for their concerns. As Sarah served the main course, he began sharing details from intelligence assessments that clearly represented some of the Navy's most closely guarded secrets about current underwater threats and historical precedents for dealing with advanced submarine capabilities. "What I'm about to share with you has been declassified specifically for this briefing," Admiral Hayes began, his tone indicating that the conversation was about to move into territory that required exceptional discretion even among officers with high-level security clearances. "Our analysis suggests that the current threat may be connected to research programs that were initiated during the height of the Cold War, but were never fully documented in accessible intelligence files. The Admiral reached into his own briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with classification stamps that indicated its contents required special handling procedures. As he began extracting documents and photographs, Sarah found herself moving more slowly around the table, her trained eye automatically cataloging details that would have been meaningless to a civilian contractor, but carried profound significance for someone with her background and operational experience. In the mid-1980s, both superpowers were investing heavily in advanced submarine stealth technologies. Admiral Hayes continued, laying out photographs of submarine hull sections and technical diagrams that Sarah recognized from her original training materials. The American program was designated Operation Deep Current, and it involved the development of acoustic dampening systems that were decades ahead of anything previously attempted. Sarah's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she reached to refill the Admiral's water glass, the mention of Operation Deep Current causing an involuntary physical response that she quickly suppressed. None of the officers noticed her momentary lapse in composure. Their attention focused entirely on the classified materials that Admiral Hayes was presenting for their review and analysis. Captain Morrison studied the historical photographs with professional interest, his expertise in submarine design allowing him to immediately recognize the significance of the hull modifications and propulsion systems depicted in the declassified images. These stealth modifications are remarkably similar to the signatures we've been tracking in current intelligence reports, he observed. Are we dealing with technology that was somehow transferred from American research programs to hostile nations? The question represented exactly the kind of intelligence assessment that Sarah had spent decades hoping would never become necessary. A recognition that the technological advantages developed through Operation Deep Current might have been compromised or stolen by adversaries who had spent years perfecting their implementation. Her presence in the Admiral's dining room at the moment such discussions were taking place struck her as either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence that her cover identity was beginning to unravel under scrutiny from intelligence analysts who possessed the clearances necessary to access her unit's historical files. Commander Chen had been reviewing technical specifications that accompanied the historical photographs, her expertise in submarine operations allowing her to quickly grasp the implications of the stealth technologies that had been developed 3 decades earlier. The acoustic dampening principles shown in these documents represent a level of sophistication that would have required years of testing and refinement, she noted. If hostile nations have been developing similar capabilities, they've had decades to perfect their implementation. Admiral Hayes nodded grimly as he continued laying out additional documents, each revealing another aspect of the Cold War, research programs that had led to Sarah's original deployment and the subsequent cover-up of her unit's continued operations. Operation Deep Current involved more than just technological development, he explained. It included operational testing by specialized personnel who were trained in deep water, reconnaissance and intelligence gathering techniques that remain classified at the highest levels. Sarah found herself frozen in place behind Admiral Hayes' chair, a serving spoon halfway to a guest's plate as she absorbed the implications of what she was hearing. The Admiral was clearly building toward a revelation about her unit's operational history, sharing information that suggested current intelligence assessments had led naval leadership to conclude that the deep current operatives might still be relevant to addressing contemporary threats. Lieutenant Commander Brooks, who had remained relatively quiet throughout the earlier discussion, suddenly looked up from the documents she had been reviewing with an expression of surprise that commanded the attention of everyone at the table. Admiral, according to these files, the Operation Deep Current personnel were listed as casualties of a submarine accident in 1985, she said, her tone reflecting confusion about the discrepancy between historical records and current operational discussions. The comment drew Sarah's attention so sharply that she accidentally clinked the serving spoon against the edge of a dinner plate, creating a small sound that momentarily interrupted the flow of conversation. Several officers glanced in her direction, with expressions of mild annoyance at the disruption, their looks carrying the kind of dismissive irritation that senior personnel typically showed toward service staff who created unnecessary noise during important discussions. "Sorry," Sarah murmured quietly, completing her serving duties and stepping back from the table with the kind of apologetic deference that was expected from civilian contractors who had inadvertently interrupted military conversations. But the moment of attention had been brief enough that none of the officers appeared to register anything unusual about her presence or reaction to their discussion. Admiral Hayes addressed Commander Brooks' question with the kind of careful precision that characterized senior officers discussing sensitive historical matters. "The official records regarding Operation Deep Current personnel contain discrepancies that reflect the compartmented nature of the program," he explained diplomatically. "The classification levels involved in deep water reconnaissance operations often resulted in incomplete documentation that can be confusing to analysts reviewing historical files." Sarah resumed her serving duties while the officers continued their analysis of the declassified materials, but her movements had acquired a subtle tension that would have been noticeable to anyone trained to observe behavioral changes under stress. Her positioning around the table had shifted almost imperceptibly, allowing her to maintain better situational awareness of exits and potential escape routes while continuing to appear focused entirely on food service responsibilities. The conversation that followed revealed additional layers of intelligence analysis that clearly indicated naval leadership's growing concern about submarine threats that exceeded the capabilities of known adversaries. Captain Morrison had begun correlating acoustic signatures from recent sonar contacts with technical specifications from the Operation Deep Current files, identifying patterns that suggested hostile nations had indeed succeeded in developing advanced stealth technologies based on American research from the 1980s. "The propulsion signatures we've been tracking suggest power plants that incorporate noise reduction techniques similar to those developed in the Deep Current program," Morrison explained, pointing to specific technical details in the declassified documents. "But the implementation is far more sophisticated than anything we documented from that era, suggesting decades of additional development and refinement." Commander Chun had been studying personnel files that accompanied the technical documentation, her attention focused on the backgrounds and qualifications of the specialists who had been involved in the original Operation Deep Current research and testing programs. The personnel assigned to this program represented some of the Navy's most highly trained underwater reconnaissance specialists, she observed. Their expertise in deep water operations and intelligence gathering would be invaluable for understanding how hostile nations might be implementing similar technologies. Sarah's grip tightened on the serving tray she was carrying, her knuckles whitening as she fought to maintain her composure, while listening to discussions that were clearly building toward conclusions about her unit's potential relevance to current operational challenges. The casual way the officers were discussing her former colleagues and their capabilities suggested that naval intelligence had begun seriously considering the possibility that some Operation Deep Current personnel might still be available for consultation or operational deployment. Admiral Hayes glanced at his watch and noted that the evening was progressing toward the point where more sensitive discussions would require enhanced security protocols. "What I'm about to share represents some of our most closely guarded intelligence assessments," he announced, reaching for another folder that bore classification markings, indicating even higher levels of restricted access than the previous documents. As Sarah moved to clear the dinner plates and prepare for dessert service, she realized that her carefully maintained cover identity was about to be tested in ways that she had not anticipated since her original deployment 3 decades earlier. The conversation around Admiral Hayes' table was clearly approaching revelations that would directly concern her unit's operational status and Potential activation for missions related to the current submarine threat. The Hamilton watch on her wrist seemed to pulse with each heartbeat as she carried the dinner dishes toward the kitchen. The timepiece that had marked decades of patient waiting, suddenly feeling like a countdown timer approaching zero. Behind her, the officers continued their classified discussion, unaware that the person serving their meal possessed first-hand knowledge of every program and operation. They were analyzing from historical documents and intelligence assessments. Part 5. Strategic Positioning and the Overlooked Truth. Sarah's return from the kitchen with dessert service coincided with Admiral Hayes' transition into the most sensitive portion of the evening's briefing, a shift in conversation that was marked by his activation of additional security protocols and the distribution of documents that required special handling procedures. As she began serving coffee and arranging dessert plates, the discussion around the table moved into territory that she had not heard addressed since her original briefings at the height of the Cold War. The intelligence we're about to review has been compartmented at levels that restrict access to fewer than 24 personnel across the entire Department of Defense, Admiral Hayes announced, his tone indicating that the conversation was entering territory that required exceptional discretion even among officers with extensive security clearances. Recent developments in submarine detection technology have forced us to reevaluate assumptions about threats that we believed had been neutralized with the end of the Cold War. Sarah positioned herself near the serving station that had been set up along the dining room's back wall, a location that provided her with clear sight lines to all exits, while allowing her to monitor the officers' conversation without appearing to pay specific attention to their classified discussions. Her training from 3 decades earlier had included extensive instruction in maintaining operational awareness while performing cover duties, skills that had become second nature during her years of hidden service. The documents that Admiral Hayes began distributing contained satellite imagery and technical analysis that clearly represented some of the Navy's most sophisticated intelligence collection capabilities. Sarah recognized the formatting and classification markings from her active duty experience, indicators that the materials had been produced by the same compartmented intelligence programs that had supported her unit's original operations in the North Pacific. Captain Morrison was the first to examine the satellite photographs in detail, his expertise in submarine operations allowing him to immediately recognize the significance of the facilities and activities depicted in the classified imagery. These construction patterns are consistent with advanced submarine manufacturing capabilities, he observed, studying images that showed industrial complexes in remote locations that would have been invisible to conventional surveillance methods. Commander Chun leaned over to examine the same photographs, her expression reflecting growing alarm as she recognized the implications of what the intelligence imagery revealed. The scale of these operations suggests a level of investment and technical capability that exceeds our previous assessments of hostile submarine programs, she noted. These facilities have clearly been under development for years without detection by our conventional intelligence collection methods. Sarah continued serving coffee and dessert while the officers analyzed the classified materials, her movements economical and unobtrusive as she absorbed information that provided crucial context for understanding the current threat situation. The satellite imagery showed submarine construction facilities that incorporated stealth technologies derived from research programs that she had helped develop during her active service with Operation Deep Current, confirming her worst fears about the long-term consequences of the intelligence compromises that had led to her unit's forced disappearance. Admiral Hayes had been watching his subordinates' analysis with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was building toward revelations that would provide even more disturbing context for the intelligence they were reviewing. What makes these developments particularly concerning, he continued, is that the technical capabilities being demonstrated suggest access to research data that should have been available only to personnel involved in the most highly classified American submarine programs. The statement hung in the air as the officers absorbed its implications, each recognizing that they were confronting evidence of intelligence compromises that might have provided hostile nations with access to some of America's most closely guarded military secrets. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that the conversation was approaching territory that would directly implicate her unit's operations and the circumstances that had led to their official deaths and unofficial continuation of service. Lieutenant Commander Brooks had been studying personnel files that accompanied the intelligence assessments. Her attention focused on the backgrounds and qualifications of American personnel who would have had access to the compromised research data. According to these files, the number of personnel with access to the relevant technical information was extremely limited, she observed. Most of the specialists involved in the original research programs were assigned to operational units that were subsequently listed as casualties of training accidents. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached to refill water glasses, the mention of training accident casualties representing a direct reference to the cover story that had been used to explain her unit's disappearance from official records. None of the officers noticed her momentary loss of composure. Their attention focused entirely on the classified materials and the implications of the intelligence compromises they were analyzing. Captain Morrison had begun correlating the satellite imagery with technical specifications from submarine detection systems, identifying patterns that suggested hostile nations had developed countermeasures specifically designed to defeat American surveillance capabilities. The stealth characteristics we've been tracking appear to be based on detailed knowledge of our sonar detection protocols, he explained. Someone has clearly studied our capabilities extensively and developed specific technologies to exploit our weaknesses. The analysis continued as Admiral Hayes distributed additional classified documents that revealed the full scope of the intelligence assessment that had prompted the evening's briefing. Sarah recognized elements of the technical data from her original training, information that had been central to her unit's operational capabilities and mission assignments during the height of the Cold War, the casual way the officers were discussing technical details that had once been known only to her unit and a handful of senior intelligence officials suggested that the current threat situation had forced naval leadership to declassify information that had been compartmented at the highest levels for nearly 4 decades. Commander Chun had been studying acoustic analysis data that accompanied the satellite imagery, her expertise allowing her to recognize the sophisticated nature of the submarine signatures that American detection systems had been tracking in recent months. The propulsion noise profiles we've documented represent a level of acoustic dampening that should be impossible with known materials and engineering techniques, she noted. These submarines are operating with stealth capabilities that exceed our current theoretical understanding of underwater sound suppression. Sarah moved to the serving station to retrieve additional coffee, using the movement to position herself where she could better observe the classified documents that the officers were reviewing. Her trained eye immediately recognized technical diagrams and acoustic signatures that matched systems her unit had helped develop during their operational testing phases, confirming that hostile nations had indeed gained access to research data that should have remained secure within American intelligence programs. Admiral Hayes had been allowing his subordinates to draw their own conclusions from the intelligence materials before providing additional context that would frame the full scope of the threat they were confronting. The technical capabilities we're observing suggest that hostile nations have had access not only to our research data, but also to operational experience and testing results that were available only to personnel directly involved in classified submarine programs, he explained. The statement carried implications that clearly alarmed the officers around the table, each recognizing that they were dealing with intelligence compromises that went far beyond simple theft of technical specifications. The suggestion that hostile nations had gained access to operational testing data implied that American personnel with direct experience in advanced submarine programs might have been compromised, captured, or turned against their own country. Lieutenant Commander Brooks looked up from the personnel files she had been reviewing with an expression of growing concern about the implications of the intelligence assessment. "Admiral, if hostile nations have had access to operational testing data from classified submarine programs, it would suggest that American personnel were either captured during operations or that there were intelligence compromises at levels that should have been impossible given the security protocols involved." Sarah felt her breathing become shallow as the conversation approached territory that directly concerned her unit's operational history and the circumstances that had led to their official deaths and continued service under deep cover. Officers' analysis was clearly building toward conclusions about intelligence compromises that had occurred during her active duty period. Revelations that might lead to questions about the fate of Operation Deep Current personnel who had been presumed lost in training accidents. Captain Morrison had been studying technical specifications that showed the evolution of submarine stealth capabilities over the past 3 decades, identifying patterns that suggested systematic development based on detailed knowledge of American research programs. The progression of capabilities we're observing indicates that hostile nations have had access to our research data for an extended period, possibly since the original development phase of these technologies, he observed. The analysis continued as Admiral Hayes provided additional context for understanding the historical background of the current threat situation. Sarah listened with growing tension as the conversation moved closer to revelations about her unit's operational status and the possibility that some Operation Deep Current personnel might still be available for consultation or active deployment against the current submarine threat. The compartmented nature of Cold War submarine programs means that much of the relevant expertise and operational experience exists only in the memories of personnel who were directly involved in classified research and testing operations, Admiral Hayes explained. Unfortunately, most of those specialists were assigned to operational units that were subsequently lost in training accidents or operational deployments. Sarah's grip tightened on the coffee pot she was holding, her knuckles whitening as she fought to maintain her composure, while listening to discussions that were clearly building toward questions about the availability and status of personnel from her former unit. The casual way Admiral Hayes was discussing the loss of Operation Deep Current, specialists suggested that he was building toward a revelation about the possibility that some of those personnel might not have been lost after all. Commander Chen had been reviewing casualty reports and personnel files related to the submarine programs under discussion. Her attention focused on identifying patterns in the timing and circumstances of the training accidents that had claimed the lives of so many specialized personnel. The concentration of casualties among personnel with access to the most sensitive technical information seems statistically unlikely, she observed. The pattern suggests either extraordinary bad luck or deliberate targeting by hostile intelligence services. The comment drew sharp attention from the other officers around the table, each recognizing the implications of systematic targeting of American submarine warfare specialists by hostile nations during the height of the Cold War. Sarah realized that the conversation was approaching conclusions about intelligence operations that might lead to questions about whether any of the presumed casualties had actually survived their reported accidents. Admiral Hayes had been building toward this moment throughout the evening's briefing, and his expression indicated that he was about to share information that would provide crucial context for understanding the current threat situation. Recent intelligence assessments have forced us to reevaluate our assumptions about the casualties suffered by specialized submarine warfare personnel during the 1980s, he announced. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as Admiral Hayes reached for another classified folder. one that bore security markings indicating access restricted to an even smaller number of personnel than the previous documents. She recognized the format and classification levels from her original briefings, indicators that the Admiral was about to reveal information about her unit's actual operational status and continued mission assignments. What I'm about to share has been declassified specifically for this briefing and represents some of our most sensitive intelligence regarding personnel who were presumed lost during classified submarine operations. Admiral Hayes continued, his tone indicating the exceptional nature of the information he was preparing to reveal. Sarah moved to clear dessert plates from the table, using the activity to mask her intense focus on the conversation while positioning herself to observe the documents that Admiral Hayes was preparing to distribute. Her training had included extensive instruction in maintaining operational security while under surveillance, but the current situation represented a level of exposure to her cover identity that she had not experienced since her original deployment. The classified folder that Admiral Hayes opened contained personnel files and operational records that Sarah recognized as relating directly to her unit's mission assignments and cover status. She could see photographs and service records that included her own official military portrait from 3 decades earlier, documents that would immediately reveal her true identity to anyone who compared them with her current appearance. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was the first to examine the newly distributed materials, her expression shifting from professional interest to shock as she recognized the implications of what the documents revealed. "Admiral, these files suggest that some personnel listed as casualties of submarine accidents may have actually survived and continued operating under deep cover assignments," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and growing understanding. The revelation created a moment of stunned silence around the table as the other officers absorbed the implications of what they were learning about the true fate of Operation Deep Current personnel. Sarah continued her serving duties with practiced composure, but every instinct developed through decades of covert operations was screaming warnings about the exposure of her carefully maintained cover identity. Captain Morrison studied the personnel files with the kind of intense scrutiny that experienced intelligence officers applied to critical operational information. According to these records, at least 7 specialists from the Operation Deep Current program were reported as casualties of a submarine accident, but there's no documentation of recovered bodies or wreckage consistent with the reported incident, he observed. Sarah's hands had begun to tremble slightly as she collected coffee cups and dessert plates. The discussion around Admiral Hayes' table moving inexorably toward revelations that would expose her true identity and operational status, she found herself automatically reviewing escape procedures and emergency protocols that she had not needed to consider for decades, her training reasserting itself as her cover identity came under unprecedented scrutiny. Commander Chun had been comparing the historical personnel files with intelligence assessments about current submarine threats, identifying connections that suggested Operation Deep Current specialists might possess unique expertise relevant to confronting the contemporary challenges facing the submarine community. The operational experience and technical knowledge represented by these personnel would be invaluable for understanding how hostile nations might be implementing advanced submarine technologies, she noted. Admiral Hayes nodded as his subordinates reached the conclusions he had been guiding them toward throughout the evening's briefing. The current threat situation has forced us to consider the possibility that some Operation Deep Current personnel might still be available for consultation or active deployment, he announced. Recent intelligence suggests that at least some of the specialists reported as casualties may have continued operating under deep cover assignments for extended periods. Sarah realized that her decades of patient waiting were approaching, and as the conversation around the Admiral's table moved toward active discussion of locating and contacting surviving Operation Deep Current personnel, the careful balance she had maintained between her cover identity and her Operational readiness was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether she could continue her hidden service or would be forced to abandon the life she had built. Over the past 38 years, the officers continued their analysis of the classified materials while Sarah completed her serving duties, each revelation bringing them closer to understanding the true scope of the intelligence resources that might be available for addressing the current submarine threat. Admiral Hayes had clearly orchestrated the evening's briefing to build toward this moment of recognition, sharing information that would prepare his subordinates for the possibility that they might soon be working with personnel whose expertise and experience had been presumed lost for nearly 4 decades. Lieutenant Commander Brooks looked up from the documents she had been studying with an expression that suggested she was beginning to piece together the full implications of what Admiral Hayes had revealed. "Sir, if Operation Deep Current personnel have been operating under deep cover for extended periods, how would we go about making contact with them?" she asked. "The security protocols involved in such operations would presumably make them extremely difficult to locate and approach safely." The question represented exactly the kind of operational challenge that Sarah had been trained to anticipate and respond to during her original briefings. Her unit had been provided with specific procedures for re-establishing contact with naval intelligence in the event that their operational status needed to be changed or their mission parameters required updating. Those procedures had remained dormant for decades, but they had been designed to remain viable even after extended periods of deep cover operations. Admiral Hayes smiled slightly as he recognized that his subordinates had reached the point of understanding that he had been building toward throughout the evening's discussion. The procedures for contacting Operation Deep Current personnel were designed to remain effective even after decades of deep cover operations, he explained. However, the implementation of those procedures requires careful coordination to avoid compromising personnel who have maintained cover identities for extended periods. Sarah felt a chill of recognition as Admiral Hayes began describing contact procedures that matched exactly the protocol she had been taught during her original training. The specific combination of timing, location, and authentication codes he outlined represented information that should have been known only to personnel directly involved in Operation Deep Current operations, suggesting that the Admiral possessed detailed knowledge of her unit's operational procedures and current status. The conversation continued as the officers discussed implementation, strategies for locating and contacting surviving Operation Deep Current personnel, each suggestion bringing them closer to actions that would directly impact Sarah's carefully maintained cover identity. She realized that her presence in Admiral Hayes' dining room during this specific briefing could not possibly be coincidental, that her assignment to serve this particular dinner represented the beginning of a contact sequence that had been decades in the making. Captain Morrison had been studying the contact procedures outlined in the classified documents with professional interest in their operational security implications. The authentication protocols described in these files would require potential contacts to demonstrate knowledge of information that should be accessible only to genuine Operation Deep Current personnel. He observed, "The system appears designed to prevent hostile intelligence services from exploiting our contact procedures." Commander Chen nodded as she reviewed the same materials, recognizing the sophisticated nature of the security measures that had been built into the contact procedures. The multi-layered authentication requirements would make it extremely difficult for anyone without genuine operational experience to successfully impersonate Operation Deep Current personnel. She agreed. Sarah continued clearing the table while absorbing every detail of the contact procedures being discussed, comparing them with her own memory of the protocols she had been taught 3 decades earlier. The match was perfect, confirming that Admiral Hayes was working from authentic operational documents and possessed the authority to implement contact sequences with surviving members of her unit. Admiral Hayes glanced at his watch as the evening's briefing approached its conclusion, his expression indicating that the conversation had accomplished its intended purpose of preparing his subordinates for potential contact with Operation Deep Current personnel. The implementation of these contact procedures will require careful coordination and exceptional operational security, he announced. Any personnel who may be contacted as part of this operation will have spent decades maintaining deep cover identities that must be protected even as we assess their availability for current operational requirements. The statement carried clear implications about the delicate nature of the contact operations that would soon be implemented. Warnings about the need to protect personnel who had sacrificed normal lives to maintain their operational readiness for missions that might never have been activated. Sarah recognized the careful balance that would be required to verify her identity and assess her capabilities without compromising the cover identity that had protected her for nearly 4 decades. As the officers began gathering their classified materials and preparing to leave Admiral Hayes' quarters, Sarah realized that her life was about to change in ways that she had both anticipated and dreaded since her original deployment. The careful routine she had maintained for 12 years at Naval Air Station Coronado was about to be disrupted by contact procedures that would force her to choose between continued anonymity and acknowledgement of her true identity and operational capabilities. The Hamilton watch on her wrist continued its steady timekeeping as she completed her serving duties. The timepiece that had marked decades of patient waiting, suddenly feeling like a countdown toward a moment of reckoning that had been inevitable since the day she had accepted her original mission assignment. Tomorrow would bring the implementation of contact procedures that would determine whether Sarah Mitchell could continue her quiet existence as a civilian contractor, or whether the woman who had once been known by a different name would be called upon to resume active service in defense of her country. Admiral Hayes' final comments to his departing guests carried undertones that confirmed Sarah's assessment of the situation she was facing. The personnel we may be contacting have maintained their operational readiness despite decades of isolation from official support systems, he noted. Their dedication to duty and their country represents the highest traditions of naval service, and they deserve our utmost respect and protection as we move forward with these operations. The words carried both promise and warning, acknowledgement of the sacrifices made by Operation Deep Current personnel combined with recognition of the delicate nature of the contact operations that would soon be implemented. Sarah understood that her response to those contact procedures would determine not only her own future, but potentially the success of operations designed to counter submarine threats that represented clear and present dangers to American national security interests. The evening's formal dinner service concluded with the methodical efficiency that had characterized Sarah's performance throughout 12 years of similar events. But as she began the process of clearing the Admiral's table and packing the specialized serving equipment, she could feel the weight of scrutiny that had not been present during any previous assignment. Admiral Hayes had dismissed his guests with the kind of diplomatic courtesy that suggested important business remained to be conducted, and the studied casualness with which he invited her to remain behind for final cleanup duties carried undertones that confirmed her assessment of the situation she was facing. Commander Chun and Captain Morrison exchanged meaningful glances as they gathered their classified materials, their expressions indicating that they understood the significance of the evening's revelations about Operation Deep Current personnel. Lieutenant Commander Brooks lingered near the dining room entrance, her attention focused on Admiral Hayes with the kind of professional alertness that suggested she recognized the importance of whatever conversation was about to unfold between the Admiral and the civilian contractor who had served their dinner. "Ms. Mitchell," Admiral Hayes said as the last of his guests departed, his tone carrying a subtle shift from the polite distance he had maintained throughout the evening toward something that approached cautious recognition. I'd appreciate if you could remain for a few additional minutes. There are some service details we should discuss regarding future catering requirements." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement while internally reviewing the escape procedures and emergency protocols that had been drilled into her memory during her original training 3 decades earlier. The Admiral's request represented exactly the kind of private conversation that her operational procedures had taught her to anticipate as the initial phase of contact. Sequences designed to verify her identity and assess her continued operational readiness. Admiral Hayes moved to activate additional security protocols within his quarters, engaging electronic countermeasures that would prevent any surveillance or monitoring of their conversation by personnel who lacked the highest levels of security clearance. The sophisticated nature of the security systems built into his residential facility reflected the exceptional sensitivity of the discussions that senior naval commanders occasionally needed to conduct away from the formal channels of official military communications. As Sarah completed her cleanup duties, she found herself automatically cataloging details about the Admiral's quarters that would be relevant for operational planning, noting the locations of secure communication equipment, emergency exits, and defensive positions that could be utilized if the situation deteriorated beyond the parameters of a routine contact sequence. Her training had emphasized that contact procedures represented potentially dangerous moments, when decades of careful cover work could be compromised by hostile intelligence services or institutional betrayal. 38 years is a long time to maintain operational discipline without official support or recognition, Admiral Hayes observed as Sarah finished packing the serving equipment, his comment delivered with the kind of careful precision that indicated he was following established protocols for initiating contact with deep cover personnel. The statement represented the first direct acknowledgement of her true identity that Sarah had heard since her original deployment, and she felt her heart rate increase as she recognized that the contact sequence she had been trained to expect was finally beginning. Her response to Admiral Hayes' opening gambit would determine whether the conversation proceeded according to established protocols or whether she would need to implement emergency procedures designed to protect her cover, identity, and operational security. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Admiral," Sarah replied, her tone maintaining the deferential courtesy expected from civilian contractors, while her mind raced through the authentication procedures she had memorized during her original briefings. The prescribed response patterns for contact sequences required careful verification of the other party's authority and knowledge before any acknowledgement of operational status could be considered safe. Admiral Hayes smiled slightly, recognizing the careful nature of her response as exactly what should be expected from a professional who had maintained deep cover for nearly 4 decades. "The Hamilton watch you're wearing bears a serial number that corresponds to equipment issued to naval personnel who were assigned to operations that officially never existed," he continued, his words following the precise authentication sequence that had been established for verifying contact authority. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her wrist, where the worn leather strap of her timepiece had left a permanent impression on her skin after decades of constant wear. The watch had been more than a simple chronometer during her years of hidden service, serving as both a symbol of her commitment to her mission and a tangible connection to the unit and operations that had shaped her adult life. Admiral Hayes' knowledge of the specific serial number and its operational significance represented authentication information that should have been accessible only to personnel with the highest levels of clearance for Operation Deep Current materials. Serial number DF447 was issued to Lieutenant Sarah Chun, United States Navy, assigned to Deep Current Reconnaissance Unit 7. Admiral Hayes continued, his voice carrying the formal tone appropriate for official recognition of classified personnel and operations. Lieutenant Chen was officially listed as killed in action during a training accident involving the submarine USS Seahawk on March 15, 1985. The use of her real name and original rank sent a chill through Sarah's carefully maintained composure, representing the first time in 38 years that anyone had addressed her by her authentic identity rather than the carefully constructed cover persona she had maintained since her official death. The sound of her own name spoken in connection with her military service triggered a flood of memories and emotions that she had spent decades suppressing in order to maintain the psychological discipline required for extended deep cover operations. Lieutenant Chun, Admiral Hayes continued, his tone shifting to acknowledge the military rank and service record that had been officially erased from all accessible databases. Your country needs to know whether you remain available for active service in connection with current threats to national security that fall within your area of operational expertise. Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders as she recognized that the moment she had both anticipated and dreaded throughout her years of hidden service had finally arrived. The careful balance she had maintained between her cover identity and her operational readiness was about to be permanently disrupted by choices that would determine not only her own future but potentially the success of operations designed to counter submarine threats that represented genuine dangers to American interests. The authentication sequence that Admiral Hayes had initiated followed exactly the protocols she had been taught during her original training, confirming that he possessed both the authority and the knowledge necessary to make legitimate contact with Operation Deep Current personnel. His recognition of her watch's significance, combined with his detailed knowledge of her service record and the circumstances of her official death, represented verification that the contact was genuine, rather than an attempt by hostile intelligence services to compromise her operational security. "Admiral," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the crisp authority of her original military training as she allowed her carefully maintained civilian facade to slip away for the first time in decades. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Deep Current Reconnaissance Unit 7, reporting for duty assessment." The formal acknowledgement of her identity and operational status marked the end of one of the longest deep cover assignments in the history of American naval intelligence, a mission that had required her to sacrifice every aspect of normal life in service of national security objectives that had remained classified at the highest levels for nearly 4 decades. Admiral Hayes' expression reflected both professional satisfaction at the successful completion of the contact sequence and personal recognition of the extraordinary dedication that her service had represented. "Lieutenant Chun, before we proceed with operational discussions, I need to verify your continued access to the technical knowledge and expertise that made your unit so valuable during the original deep current operations," Admiral Hayes said, moving to a secure communication terminal that would allow him to access compartmented intelligence databases. "The current threat situation involves submarine technologies that appear to be based on research programs that were contemporary with your original deployment." Sarah nodded her understanding, recognizing that the verification process would require her to demonstrate retained knowledge of technical information and operational procedures that had been central to her unit's original mission assignments. The decades she had spent maintaining her cover identity had not diminished her memory of the specialized training and expertise that had qualified her for selection to one of the Navy's most classified reconnaissance programs. Admiral Hayes activated the secure terminal and began displaying technical specifications and intelligence assessments that Sarah immediately recognized as relating to advanced submarine stealth technologies of the type her unit had been trained to detect and counter during their original operations. The acoustic signatures and propulsion characteristics shown in the classified data matched exactly the kind of threats that Operation Deep Current had been designed to address through deep water reconnaissance and intelligence gathering missions. These submarine contacts have been detected operating in the North Pacific using stealth technologies that appear to incorporate principles derived from research programs that were classified at the highest levels during the 1980s. Admiral Hayes explained, displaying sonar analysis data that showed acoustic signatures unlike anything in current American intelligence databases. Our assessment is that hostile nations gained access to American research data and have spent decades developing operational capabilities based on that compromised information. Sarah studied the technical data with the focused intensity that had characterized her approach to intelligence analysis during her active duty career, her trained eye immediately identifying patterns and characteristics that confirmed her worst fears about the long-term consequences of the security compromises that had led to her unit's forced disappearance from official records. The submarine signatures displayed on Admiral Hayes' secure terminal represented exactly the kind of advanced threat that Operation Deep Current had been created to monitor and counter. The acoustic dampening characteristics shown in these profiles are consistent with hull modifications based on research that was conducted as part of the Deep Current Technical Development Program, Sarah observed, her analysis drawing on decades-old knowledge that remained vivid in her memory despite years of disuse. The propulsion signatures suggest power plants that incorporate noise reduction techniques that were classified at compartmented levels during our original deployment period. Admiral Hayes nodded with satisfaction as Sarah's technical assessment confirmed that she retained the specialized expertise that had originally qualified her for Operation Deep Current assignment. Our intelligence indicates that these submarines are operating as part of a coordinated program designed to test American detection capabilities while gathering intelligence about our current anti-submarine warfare procedures, he continued. The sophistication of their operations suggests that they possess detailed knowledge of our surveillance networks and response protocols. The briefing continued as Admiral Hayes provided additional context for understanding the current threat situation and its relationship to the original deep current operations that had defined Sarah's early military career. The intelligence he shared painted a picture of systematic exploitation of American submarine technology by hostile nations that had gained access to classified research data through compromises that had never been fully understood or countered by American intelligence services. The current situation requires personnel with operational experience in deep water reconnaissance and the technical expertise to understand how hostile nations might be implementing advanced submarine technologies, Admiral Hayes explained. Your unit's original mission parameters included exactly the kind of intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities that we need to counter the current threat. Sarah recognized that Admiral Hayes was building toward a formal request for her return to active service, a possibility that she had considered throughout her years of deep cover operations, but had never been certain would actually materialize. The careful life she had constructed as Sarah Mitchell was about to be abandoned in favor of resuming the identity and responsibilities that had been officially buried for nearly 4 decades. Admiral, before I can commit to active service, I need to understand the scope of the operations you're contemplating and the resources that would be available for mission support, Sarah replied, her response reflecting the professional caution that had been instilled during her original training. Deep water reconnaissance missions involve risks that require comprehensive planning and backup procedures that may not be available given the classified nature of our previous operations. Admiral Hayes appreciated the careful nature of her response, recognizing that Operation Deep Current personnel had been trained to approach all operational commitments with thorough risk assessment and contingency planning. The missions we're considering would involve both intelligence, analysis, and potential field operations designed to gather information about hostile submarine capabilities and operational procedures, he explained. You would be working with current naval intelligence personnel who have been briefed on the historical background of deep current operations. The prospect of resuming active naval service after 38 years of civilian life represented both an opportunity to fulfill the mission commitments that had defined her adult life and a challenge that would require her to adapt decades-old training to contemporary operational requirements. Sarah realized that her decision would not only affect her own future, but would potentially influence the success of operations designed to counter submarine threats that represented genuine dangers to American national security. Admiral Hayes, I want you to understand that my commitment to Operation Deep Current has never wavered during my years of deep cover assignment, Sarah said, her voice carrying the firm resolve that had sustained her through decades of patient waiting. If the current threat situation requires my return to active service, I am prepared to resume my duties as a naval intelligence officer. The formal acceptance of active service marked the completion of Sarah's transition from deep cover civilian contractor to acknowledged naval personnel, a transformation that had been decades in the making, but was accomplished in a matter of minutes through the implementation of contact procedures that had been designed during the height of the Cold War. Admiral Hayes' expression reflected both professional satisfaction and personal respect for the dedication that her service had represented. Lieutenant Chun, your return to active service will be handled through channels that protect both your safety and the operational security of ongoing intelligence programs, Admiral Hayes assured her. The cover identity you've maintained for the past 12 years will be preserved as a potential asset for future operations, but your primary assignment will involve working with current intelligence personnel to assess and counter the submarine threats we've identified. Sarah nodded her understanding of the operational procedures that would govern her return to active service, recognizing that the transition would require careful coordination to avoid compromising either her safety or the effectiveness of ongoing intelligence operations. The Hamilton watch on her wrist continued its steady timekeeping, but its significance had fundamentally changed from a symbol of patient waiting to a marker of active service resumption. The conversation continued as Admiral Hayes outlined the preliminary arrangements for Sarah's reintegration into active naval service, including security briefings, medical evaluations, and technical training updates that would prepare her for operations involving contemporary submarine warfare technologies. The scope of the preparations confirmed that the Navy was taking the current threat situation seriously and was committed to utilizing every available resource to counter the sophisticated submarine capabilities that hostile nations had developed. The other surviving members of your unit are being contacted through similar procedures, Admiral Hayes informed her, revealing that Sarah's return to active service was part of a broader operation to reassemble Operation Deep Current personnel for missions related to the current threat situation. Your combined expertise and operational experience represent unique capabilities that are not available through any other personnel or programs within current naval intelligence structure. Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and concern at the prospect of reuniting with former unit members whom she had not seen or contacted for decades, colleagues who had shared the unique experience of official death and continued service under deep cover assignments. The reunion would represent both a professional opportunity and a personal challenge that would require careful management to avoid compromising the operational security that had protected all of them throughout their years of hidden service. As the evening's conversation approached its conclusion, Sarah realized that her life was about to change in ways that would require her to abandon the careful routine and quiet anonymity that had characterized her existence for more than a decade. The woman who had served coffee to naval officers while remaining invisible in the background was about to resume her identity as a highly trained intelligence specialist whose expertise was crucial for addressing threats to American national security. Admiral Hayes stood and moved to a wall safe from which he withdrew a small wooden box bearing official naval insignia, opening it to reveal a set of lieutenant's bars and naval intelligence specialist badges that represented Sarah's restoration to official military status. Lieutenant Chun, it is my honor to welcome you back to active service in the United States Navy, he said, offering her the insignia that would mark her transition from civilian contractor to acknowledged military personnel. Sarah accepted the insignia with hands that trembled slightly from the emotional impact of formal recognition after decades of anonymous service, understanding that the simple metal symbols represented not only her own return to acknowledged status but also the Navy's commitment to utilizing every available resource to defend American interests against sophisticated threats. The Hamilton watch on her wrist had marked time through 38 years of patient waiting, and now it would continue its faithful service as she resumed the active duty career that had been interrupted but never abandoned. The final arrangements for Sarah's return to active service would be completed over the following days through secure channels that would protect both her safety and the operational requirements of the intelligence programs she would be joining. But the essential transformation had already occurred in Admiral Hayes' quarters, where a woman who had spent decades maintaining a carefully constructed civilian identity had formally acknowledged her true status as a naval intelligence officer, whose expertise was crucial for addressing contemporary threats to national security. As Sarah prepared to leave the Admiral's quarters and return to her apartment for what would likely be the last time as a civilian contractor, she understood that her years of patient service in the shadows had finally led to the moment of recognition and active deployment that had always represented the ultimate purpose of her mission. The Hamilton watch continued its steady timekeeping, marking the transition from one phase of service to another in a career that had been defined by dedication to duty and commitment to protecting American interests regardless of personal cost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.